On July 23, 2025, inside the Ada County Courthouse in Boise, the legal proceedings against Bryan Kohberger reached their final conclusion. Kohberger, a former PhD student in criminology, had reached a plea deal to avoid the death penalty for the murders of 4 University of Idaho students. The terms were absolute. He received 4 consecutive fixed life sentences without the possibility of parole. Under Idaho law, this means he has no path to release. He is guaranteed to die in prison. However, the plea required only an admission of guilt. It did not require him to offer a motive or provide any account of his actions leading up to the night of November 13th. While the court achieved legal finality, the families were left without the information they had sought for 3 years. They walked away with a conviction, but the central question of why the murders happened remained unanswered. During his victim impact statement, Steve Goncalves, a father of Kaylee Goncalves, addressed Kohberger directly. He described the killer as careless, foolish, and stupid. These descriptions stand in contrast to Kohberger's academic history. He was a doctoral student specifically studying the science of criminal decision-making, a field dedicated to understanding how and why crimes are committed. Yet investigators found a military-style knife sheath at the crime scene. It contained a single source of DNA that was eventually matched to Kohberger's relative through a public genealogy database. He also drove his own white Hyundai Elantra to the neighborhood on the night of the killings. Surveillance footage and witness reports allowed investigators to track the vehicle's movements. Cell phone data provided further evidence. It showed Kohberger had visited the neighborhood near the King Road house at least 12 times in the months before the murders, often in the middle of the night. For the families, these basic errors highlight a jarring contradiction. They are mourning a tragedy that resulted from the actions of a man who studied criminal behavior, yet left behind a clear trail of physical and digital evidence. The impact of the crime extends to the 2 roommates who were home but were not attacked. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke provided statements to the court detailing the psychological weight of surviving that night. Both women raised the same question: why did Kohberger kill 4 of their friends while leaving them unharmed in the same house? Autopsy results released in 2026 detailed the scale of the violence. The 4 victims suffered a combined total of at least 150 stab wounds, most of them inflicted while they were asleep. Xana Kernodle was stabbed 67 times. Forensic evidence suggests she was the only victim who was awake and attempted to fight back before she died. Despite the brutality, investigators could find no prior contact between Kohberger and the victims. There was no established relationship and no digital communication to explain why he chose that specific residence. This lack of a clear motive has left the survivors in a state of ongoing uncertainty. Dylan Mortensen told the court she still checks her room every night, living with a sense of fear that has not subsided since the murders. In one of the hearing's most unexpected moments, Xana Kernodle's aunt, Kim, spoke directly to Kohberger. She told him she had chosen to forgive him so she wouldn't have to live with hate. Her forgiveness came with a request. She invited him to call her at any time if he ever wanted to talk about why he chose to enter that house. This offer highlights the position the families are in. They are willing to engage with the person who destroyed their lives just to understand the reasoning behind the tragedy. When Judge Stephen Hippler gave Kohberger the opportunity to speak to the families or explain his motive, Kohberger replied with 2 words: "I respectfully decline." He is now held in long-term restrictive housing at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. He spends 23 hours a day in a cell, with 1 hour for recreation, and is moved only in restraints. By accepting the plea and waiving his right to appeal, he ended the legal process. There are no more trials or hearings that could compel him to answer the questions the families have been asking. While Kohberger remains in solitary confinement, the families and the 2 surviving roommates continue to live with the aftermath of his silence. The phone call invited by Xana's aunt has not happened. The justice system has ensured Kohberger will remain in prison for the rest of his life. But by choosing not to speak in court, he has ensured the families will likely never know the motive behind the murders of their children. Today, we're diving into a case that is defined by a truly chilling irony. We're looking at the story of a criminal justice student who literally spent his academic career studying the minds of criminals, only to take that very knowledge and use it to commit a horrific murder. It's a case that gripped the entire nation, and as you'll see, the final resolution left absolutely everyone with one agonizing, unanswered question. Because here's the paradox, right? This is the hook of this entire tragedy. Bryan Kohberger wasn't just your run-of-the-mill suspect. We're talking about a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University in Pullman. He was actively studying criminal decision-making, and he lived right across the state border from Moscow, Idaho, where his victims lived. He had all the academic theory in the world under his belt, and yet his practical execution of this nightmare left a trail of evidence that brought his whole world crashing down.
Part 1. The criminologist turned killer.
So, to really understand who exactly we are talking about, we've got to trace his journey from the East Coast out to the Pacific Northwest. Born back in 1994 in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, Kohberger's youth was actually pretty rough. He struggled with social development and self-described drug use. But he claimed he overcame all of that through a strict diet and exercise routine. He eventually earned his degrees from DeSales University before landing a spot as a PhD student and a teaching assistant at WSU. But, his peers painted a slightly different picture. They described him as highly intelligent, sure, but incredibly selfish, like the kind of guy who would manipulate others into doing his work for him. A friend even noted he was super fixated on getting a girlfriend, bringing it up all the time. And then there's this really suspicious detail. In October and November of 2022, right around the time of the murders, he showed up with these unexplained scratch marks on his face. His excuse? He claimed he'd been in a car accident.
Part 2. The November murders.
Now, what happened next in the quiet college town of Moscow, Idaho, completely shattered the community and ended 4 promising lives. Phone data shows that in the months leading up to November, the suspect visited the neighborhood of the King Roadhouse at least 12 times, and usually it was in the dead of night. Then, in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, Kohberger entered the rental home. 6 University of Idaho students lived or were staying there that night, including Ethan Chapin, who was just visiting his girlfriend Xana. During the attack, one of the surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen, actually opened her door and saw a man in a mask with bushy eyebrows. Terrified, she locked her door. It wasn't until the following afternoon, feeling that something was just terribly wrong, that she called a friend over, who then finally dialed 911. Kaylee Goncalves, 21 years old. Madison Mogan, 20. Xana Kernodle, 20. And Ethan Chapin, 20. 4 young lives gone. And that number, 150, that is the shocking combined number of stab wounds they suffered. Newly unsealed autopsy documents from January 2026 laid bare the sheer scale of the violence. Xana Kernodle suffered 67 wounds. Kaylee Goncalves had 38. Madison Mogan, 28. Ethan Chapin, 17. The records show that 3 of the 4 victims were attacked in their sleep. They couldn't even stand up. But the scene tells a truly heartbreaking story of survival instinct for Xana. Blood was found on her feet, strongly suggesting she attempted to stand up and fight back against her attacker.
Part 3. The digital investigation.
For weeks, Moscow, a town that literally hadn't seen a murder in 5 years, was completely paralyzed with fear. Students fled the campus, the university practically had to shut down. But behind the scenes, investigators were moving fast. They were piecing the puzzle together. Despite being a criminology PhD student, Kohberger made some seriously careless mistakes that essentially created a masterclass in modern digital forensics. First, a white Hyundai Elantra was caught on surveillance, and that eventually led them right to Kohberger. Then, they found his cell phone pinged near the house those 12 previous times. But the ultimate downfall? A military-style knife sheath left right on the bed. Investigators pulled DNA from it, ran it through a public genetic genealogy database, which, by the way, is a tool famous for breaking cold cases, and matched it to his relative. By late December, he was arrested at his parents' house in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where he'd driven after the killings. Oh, and his own Amazon history, it showed he actually bought the knife and sheath, even though the weapon itself was never found.
Part 4. The guilty plea. After nearly 3 years of grueling legal proceedings, sweeping gag orders, and sealed documents that journalists fought tooth and nail to open, everything came to an abrupt halt. The plea deal was remarkably simple. In July 2025, Kohberger pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. He waived his right to appeal. In exchange, Judge Stephen Hippler sentenced him to 4 consecutive fixed life sentences, plus 10 years for burglary, with absolutely no possibility of parole. He avoids the death penalty, and he will die in prison.
Now, the split among the victims' families at the sentencing hearing was incredibly raw, and it really underscored the agonizing emotional toll of this case. Some families felt immense relief that they wouldn't have to endure a traumatic, years-long trial. Others were deeply, deeply angry, feeling a jury and the death penalty were the only true forms of justice. But perhaps the most startling moment of all came from Xana Kernodle's aunt, Kim. She actually offered forgiveness. She stated she could no longer live with hate in her heart, and she even invited him to contact her if he ever wanted to talk about what happened.
During the victim impact statements, Kaylee's father, Steve Goncalves, stared directly at Kohberger and delivered this line. "You were that careless, that foolish, that stupid." He was directly mocking the sheer irony of a criminology scholar who thought he was this untouchable mastermind, only to carelessly leave his DNA on a sheath at the crime scene. But honestly, the emotional core of this explainer, the lingering devastation, is captured perfectly in the words of surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen. Speaking publicly for the first time, she asked, "Why me? Why did I get to live and not them?" She described checking her room every single night to make sure no one was hiding. Bethany Funk, the other survivor, completely echoed this in her written statement, calling it the worst day of her life.
Part 5. The unanswered question.
The legal case is closed, the gavel has fallen, but the story isn't truly over because of the massive void left behind. We're left with this heartbreaking contrast between legal finality and the complete, utter absence of a motive. The family's got a guilty plea, 4 life sentences, and solitary confinement. Justice, in the eyes of the law, has been served, but they got absolutely no explanation. Kohberger didn't explain why he chose those specific students. He didn't explain why he lurked in their neighborhood. He didn't explain why he spared the 2 surviving roommates. The family's got a guilty plea and complete silence.
Take this quote from Idaho's State Police Lieutenant Darren Gilbertson. It really drives home the absolute mystery of this crime. Investigators scoured his digital life, his physical life, literally everything, and they found zero connection, no relationship, no prior contact whatsoever between a 31-year-old PhD student and these young university students.
So, as of early 2026, this is Bryan Kohberger's reality. He's at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, living in J Block. That's long-term restrictive housing. We're talking solitary confinement. He is in his cell 23 hours a day, allowed a shower every other day, and moved only in restraints. He waived his right to appeal, so he has 0 legal proceedings pending. And most importantly, when given the chance to speak in court, he just said, "I respectfully decline." He refuses to speak.
Why? Why did he do it? Why those 4? Why did he spare the others? Because Kohberger waived his appeals, there are no legal mechanisms left that can ever compel him to answer. The cameras have packed up, the courtrooms are empty, but this single question remains. Kohberger is taking the only answer to this question into a concrete cell, keeping it locked away until he dies, leaving the families and those 2 surviving roommates in the dark forever. Thank you for joining me for this explainer.